Yes, good morning all. So we've already heard the importance of the threat landscape and how attacks are getting more complicated, and Vodafone, Giorgio, has kind of set the scene for us. What we're now going to do is move on to look at the threat landscape in more detail. So 2022 for me was very much the year of 5G RAN moving into 2023. 24 is going to be the year of the 5G core. So we're at a very sort of pivotal point from a security perspective. We're rolling out new networks. The attackers potentially are waiting to have a go at those. So this next session is very much going to set the scene for you for the rest of the event. Conveniently, we'll be following it up at the end with a 6G session that will sort of reflect back where we go. So we've got a panel coming up, but for now, I'm very pleased to welcome Jeremy Thompson, Vice President Huawei Europe, to the stage, who's going to give us a keynote and set that landscape that little bit more. Before I just say, we will come back and have a panel session on the details. So, Jeremy, welcome you very much to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Jeremy Thompson, and I work for Huawei with special responsibility for security in the European region. So first of all, welcome to London. London is the financial district for the UK, but actually it also has some relevance for our own industry. And about a 5-minute walk up the hill towards St. Paul's is a plaque which talks about an event that took place 127 years ago by an Italian, another Italian, although he did have an Irish mother, and his name was Marconi, and it was the first public transmission of wireless telecommunications in the City of London. He came to London because he felt that his invention would get sponsorship, and he stayed, and the rest is history. When I used to walk past that plaque on the way to work, it's actually on the outside of what was BT's headquarters. We were just moving from sort of 2G into 3G. I feel I'm a telecommunications historian sometimes, actually, but bear with me. So 2G was all about voice, and 4G we knew was going to be about apps. We didn't know that a struggling computer company would redefine the industry, and I guess we're in some respects we're at that stage now with 5G, because we know it's not all about the devices, but we know it's going to be about devices, and there will be some major disruptions to our industry, possibly coming from outside our industry. But we expect there to be 200 billion connections by 2030. So that's a lot of devices connected. And 390 robots per 1,000 workers. So the working environment is going to change, and it was very appropriate to hear from Vodafone about the private networking, and 1 million corporate private 5G networks is what we're expecting. So all these new opportunities that we have will only be realized if there is trust in those networks, and that's really what the next 2 days is about. So we have new opportunities, but new challenges. And as has been mentioned already, the bad guys, there are more of them, and they're getting better. And some of the attacks are totally vicious it's not just calls to our grandmothers. It's a very serious set of attacks. And the industry is responding. With things like FIRST, the Forum for Incident Response and Security Teams. More and more people are joining the good guys to fight against the bad guys. And there's also cooperation between the industry with the various CERT programs. And then also reflecting a little bit more of telecoms history. So 20 years ago, the Communications Act of 2003, Section 105, said that the operators should take appropriate measures for resilience in their network. But the expression was appropriate measures. 2 years ago in the UK, but actually throughout the globe, governments are now implementing very detailed specifications of requirements or codes of practice for operators to follow. And these aren't sort of 3 words, take appropriate measures, which English people kind of understand. They like that kind of vagary, but now it's 100 pages of specification. And the fine for failure was £4 million. And I'm not sure that anyone was ever fined for that, actually. But the fine for failure now is typically sort of 10% of revenues. So this is really serious for the operators. And as a vendor to the operators, we take this really, really seriously ourselves. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we approach the vulnerability management part of it. But the first thing I want to say is that this is a team game, and we in the industry regularly use the 3-layer security model, and we see our role in that. But actually, I wanted to call out and thank the GSMA for their contributions. Specifically the mobile cybersecurity knowledge base and NESAS. These are industry-leading activities that really help bring the industry together. And we need this kind of activity from the GSMA and other activities of which we'll go through. So what's our approach? Well, having set the scene that things are getting more difficult from an attack point of view, and also from a statement of requirements point of view, Huawei's looked at its own processes and activities, and we've sort of defined our vision as reducing the harm caused by the vulnerabilities and mitigate the risks to the customer's networks. Very, very easy words to put on a slide, but when you've got 100,000 or so engineers and sort of top 5 R&D budgets in the world and operating in 170 countries worldwide, that's a mammoth task. And we've been at this for some years. We launched our cybersecurity and privacy activity in full form in 2012. But 5 years ago, we looked at the transformation of our engineering practices. And that's very detailed work, looking at configuration management, coding standards, lifecycle management. And we were looking at the policies and the standards that are available to us, looking at the roles and responsibilities. This is not just actually for vulnerability management, but I'm using vulnerability management as an example, because you've got to be really clear as to who's doing what in part of the organization, and increasing the capability within the business, which I'll talk a little bit about later, and the process, and then embedding that into our IT systems. The first thing we did is looked at all the standards and best practices that are around there at the moment. And we had a small army of people crawling all over this activity for several months before we even started the project. And there is a lot of input, a lot of overlap in that input, and you'll be quite familiar with this. Some of these are about incident management, some of them about coding standards, some of them about general security. Our capability, we we're sort of building 5 capabilities. And I mentioned that we have this 5-year program, but of course, it doesn't. The transformation is 5 years, but it's ongoing. And what we realized is that we needed to have better communications, better understandings, better channels from the where the issues were, where the vulnerability was. So we had to increase our vulnerability awareness, and that's why things like knowledge base and other activities. So we're open to taking all these feeds, not just relying on our own research, doing black hat days and things like white hat days and things like that. So we are open to that activity. And then we needed to trace where the vulnerability was. Now, it may sound relatively straightforward, but if you do operate in 170 countries with a number of different products, you need to know precisely what version is in which network. And we have become much tighter in our version management. And we're really clear as to what version is in what network. And of course, a lot of these are open sourced code as well. So we need to be really smart on that, and we're proactively working on that. And then we look at the remediation, how quickly we can fix. And then the disclosure. I'll talk a little bit about disclosure later on. In fact, right now. Disclosure. We've always had the ability to communicate proactively with our customers. But looking at the attacks and the volume of attacks that are taking place across all different networks on all different kinds of software, we had to become more systematic, and we've adopted the PCERT process with certain customers. We encourage our customers to do that. And now we've established a website for our customers where we will notify to the website, and then the customer has the ability to access that website and know precisely what versions they have and how this might impact their business. And given that we work with very large organizations, there are multiple people inside the organization who need to know this information. So we've packaged that up in a way that it can be very quickly distributed to our customers, and all the way through to their network management teams and their own product teams. So what's our goal? Is to have fewer product vulnerabilities. Hence the 5-year plan, transformation plan, and the best part of $2 billion of investment. We want to be able to investigate very, very quickly and to assess the risks. Prioritization is just as important as a rapid response. And then get the deployment of the vulnerability patches as quickly as possible. So we operate as part of a wider industry, and that's already been referenced a few times. We work very closely with our suppliers and the supply chain to ensure that they meet the standards of our industry, and I would say the increasing standards of our industry. And we service the operator in their environment. And as I'm sure we're going to hear over the next couple of days from the operators, from the enterprise customers, and the device manufacturers, we are a key link in that process. And I hope over the next 2 days, you enjoy the time spent together to understand how we can secure this environment together. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, so hopefully the slides will move on. There we go. Excellent. So we've now, I think, fully set the scene. As Jeremy said, we've gone from appropriate measures to, certainly with the UK perspective, 140 pages of TSR. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to welcome to the stage the first of the panel sessions. So these are the ones I really enjoy doing. So if I can welcome the speakers, please, for the next session. So Carl Taylor from Hutchison, Justin Williams from MTN, Mike Short from the UK Innovation Network, and Morgan Ramsey. If I can ask you to say for me the left-hand or the right-hand seat. It's been an interesting challenge for you. I'll tell you what, I'll have the right-hand one. And I shall settle myself down with the rest of you. So, hopefully the mics are working. It's a good test for the back. Yes, they are. So, we've set the scene. There will be an opportunity, hopefully, for you to ask some questions as well. But as usual, I have some preset ones, which the panellists have agreed to, which is always good. I think the first thing, though, is, and this was picked up on by Giorgio, everything we do, whether it is telecoms or services or whatever we produce in the ecosystem, is ultimately for the users. And I think that's where I want to start with this, is we're seeing the attacks, a lot of which are continuing into 2023, phishing, malware and other things. They're not getting any easier. The users are still being hit. Now, whether those are enterprise or consumers, what I want to do is start, I think, with that perspective, is how as the industry and the operators can we do better, A, from an education piece, but to try and lower those attacks and the effects they're having. So perhaps I'll start with Morgan, actually, from an FASG perspective. What more can we do?
Okay, well, I'll just quickly introduce myself so you know the perspective I'm coming from. So I'm Morgan Ramsey. I'm a senior fraud manager in Vodafone Group, but I'm also the deputy chair of the GSMA's fraud and security group. And I very much represent the fraud part of the fraud and security group. I am not a security expert, and I shall be looking very intently at my shoes if the conversation goes into very technical territory. But the main point for me on this is the convergence or the intersection between fraud and security. And that is something that if we're going to protect customers in the 5G world, we have to do a better job of. And yes, a lot of operators have already moved in that direction, but there is a lot more that we can do to make sure that the fraud teams and the security teams are working closely together. So I'll just give an example of where that maybe doesn't work so well today and we can improve it, is incident management. So it's very well developed in the security world. We've already seen it called out on one of the slides this morning. To speak from a fraud management perspective, we're often a bit of an afterthought in some of the management of incidents. So that for me is a great place to start. Let's bring those teams together and formalise how we will collectively respond to security incidents. I could go on in terms of the list of where we need to bring our efforts more closely together, but I'll maybe leave it there and free it up for someone else.
Yeah, and obviously as we go around, I'm going to stick sort of on the time. I'm going to ask you to introduce for the first responses sort of your perspective as well. So Justin, again as an operator, how can we do better, and what's your sort of opening pitch to the audience?
Okay, so I'm Justin Williams, Group CISO for MTN. We operate primarily across Africa and the Middle East. So that does give me a little bit of a different perspective when I look at the maturity of our customers. You know, we probably still have about a 50% smartphone penetration, more or less. That number's going up. Still have a lot of 2G, 3G usage across the environment. We're kind of moving towards 200 million data customers from 80-odd million 4 or 5 years ago. So that is many people being connected to the internet for the very first time. So now when you look at the maturity of the customer, it's a vastly different situation. And you know, Alex, as you said, a lot of the attacks are the same attacks that were there 4 or 5 years ago. They've just been modified slightly, and the attackers keep just modifying them enough just to stay ahead of what's happening. If they start to become less successful, they change them. if I look internally within our organization, and I look at the kinds of attacks that are there using, let's say, modified phishing attacks against execs and the like, they constantly get more and more sophisticated. The latest beautiful ones we have is that we use Adobe Sign as a signing platform. The attackers have now created their own Adobe Sign accounts, so they send phishing type mails that are indistinguishable from genuine Adobe Sign type requests, and the execs get them, are requested to sign a document, but now embedded within there's a phishing link, and so if they're not completely awake, it's a problem. So you've got that level of attack happening, while at the same time having people who have been using the internet for 6 months or a year. So education is crucially important, but trying to uplift almost an entire continent as you provide services to them, it's not an easy thing.
And maybe moving to Carl to sort of complete the international picture from the operator perspectives.
Yeah, so I support that point that the attacks are getting much more sophisticated. We're seeing a number of different tools being used at the same time. We're finding also to Morgan's point that within our company, fraud and security collaboration, despite what we write in CM scripts and best practices, it's not good. In fact, we're seeing a drift of skills. The fraud investigators tend to be people that are deeply into fraud. They might be ex-policemen or policewomen. They have motivations based on customer experience scores and monies recovered, landmark cases achieved. They've got a completely different mindset to the security teams that are reaching out to AI tools for endpoint detection and response, and moving very fast down a route of detection, automation, fast response. The skill sets, even the age groups of the people in fraud compared to the people in security are noticeably different. So I'm afraid all I can do is add to the problem statement rather than provide any solutions.
Which is always the way. And perhaps moving to Mike, I mean, from your sort of research innovation lead perspective, you're perhaps able to give us a perspective on where could we invest more, where could we, technology-wise or otherwise, how could we use technology to try and improve some of this?
So just a brief introduction, I was chairman GSMA some 28 years ago, and the world has changed a lot in that period of time. But after 30 years in telecoms, I did 5 years as chief scientist in the UK government, and I was asked recently would I chair the UK Telecoms Innovation Network Advisory Board. I'll say more about that later, but briefly in terms of technology is part of the solution, it's not the whole solution. But I would observe that having been chairman GSMA some 25 or so years ago, fraud and security has moved on hugely. We are now talking about fraud and security to help our customers as opposed to the operator side alone. And I think when we think about protecting our customers, we've got an awful lot to do from an innovation point of view. So having discussions like this is really helpful because it helps to expose how do we deal with some of these issues. Some of the technology that's moving on is clearly much more than the old voice world or the old early data world that we used to have. But I think we need to work cohesively on things like resilience of networks. We need to work cohesively on the reputation of our industry as a solution provider, hence the Vodafone presentation earlier on. I think some of the work done by key vendors, Huawei referred to this earlier, in terms of actually thinking about certification and vulnerabilities, minimizing the risk, these all need some help. But I think unless we discuss it, the research community can't really engage. So I think discussing it where the research community can bring in ideas is great. I think the direction of identity management, I think, is key to this for both services to the customer and to protect networks. I think the direction and role of government in regulating these areas is also important. It's not just saying this has to be a regulated industry with even more depth of regulation. It's saying what are the practical solutions that the public, businesses or consumers, what do they expect? So I think expectations having risen, not just because of COVID, but just because of what we do on our networks today, we need to look at more robust mechanisms for resilience and reach.
Cool. And obviously, as from both Giorgio and Jeremy's keynotes, telecoms is not a national activity. If we look around the room, we look at the vendor makeup, and we look at indeed the effort that goes into things like 3GPP and its global reach. It is a global technology. So what I now perhaps want to consider on that basis is regulation varies country to country, but operators work internationally. The enterprises that we are talking about later in the event and the verticals don't just want to run their services in single countries. They want to move things around the world. So if I now come, and I'm going to start with Carl, can you perhaps explain a little bit around the challenges you see around international or the divergence of regulation and the impact it has, and perhaps things as the industry we can do to try and minimise that if we can adopt a collaborative approach?
Okay, well, sorry, I should have introduced myself. So I'm Carl Taylor. I've been working for CK Hutchison for about 20-something years. I'm here primarily because I work on the GSMA Technology Group, and I've previously chaired that body for a while. And I've been the sponsor of some of the fraud and security activities in GSMA. So CK Hutchison is a global business. It's got more than just the 11 telecoms networks. It also does a lot of ports and retail and infrastructure and energy. And we operate in over 50 countries around the world. And that's a massive cybersecurity challenge. If you can imagine that for the last year I've been trying to introduce international, applicable, minimum cybersecurity standards across the corporate group. So just the basic challenge of trying to make sure that everyone's device is secure. We have over 300,000 employees. So when I want to lock all them down, it's quite unpopular and rather difficult and expensive to do. But beyond that, obviously we have minimum cybersecurity controls. We need to make sure that investors understand that we've got those controls in place. Our CEOs need to be able to talk to that kind of script. As an example, we run a rolling heat map of all cybersecurity issues and preparedness across the group, and we review that with the group CFO every month. We've got common auditing principles across the group. But yet again, regulation is different in every market, and we find from cybersecurity we'll come on to things like reporting later, but the gentleman from Huawei was talking about CSERTs and TISACs and so on. In some countries that we operate, we're not allowed to join those kind of information sharing things. There's an obligation report to the security regulator, but we cannot disclose to any third party. Sometimes the regulator will say they take a decision about whether we can release that information, but then there's an understanding step of the regulator and a time to respond, and quite often the information then becomes out of date. So different markets, different places. Even within Europe, it's vastly different between Sweden and Italy as compared to our obligations in Austria, for example. And in Hong Kong, the situation there with the Chinese National Security Regulator is perhaps more similar to what we're seeing in the UK. So we have to build these kind of security approaches which are applicable to a very large group. The challenge, of course, is that each of the businesses have different budgets, they have different capabilities, and they also stretched out along a technology path which ranges from 2G all the way through to 5G advanced. And that means our ability to sort of buy tools at scale and deploy them across the group is really limited, because actually some of them are in a purchasing loop that they've just bought a tool, they only need it for their 2G operations in Sri Lanka, and that's completely different to what we'd need on a brand new ZTE network in Austria. So it's very localised, and we're not getting scalability out of our group approach. So these are some of the biggest challenges for me at the moment.
And perhaps similarly, Morgan, I mean, Vodafone, again, massive global operator. How do you see it, and how could we do better in this space?
So, yeah, we'll never get away from the complexity of different regulations, different technology market by market, different cultures market by market in terms of how receptive they might be within the employee base to certain things that we're asking. So the way I see it is you just have to if you're going to have a chance of navigating that, you have to try and get ahead of it a little bit. Because generally what regulators are laying down for us is not an enormous surprise. You can see it coming. So if I just take, again, a sort of more fraud relevant example, regulation around protecting customers from phishing and smishing is landing pretty steadily country by country at the moment, and that is no surprise at all. And just to speak for Vodafone, in some markets we're fairly well positioned for that, in others maybe not so much. If we, going back, let's say 2 or 3 years, we had been a bit more focused on the fact that that was very likely to happen, or a bit more motivated by the fact that that was very likely to happen, we might have started to put in place more of the technology, processes and other activities needed to mitigate it. So just one example, to protect against smishing you need a high level of SMS firewall. And again, we don't have that in every market, so we're not able to protect customers in the way that we should be at this point in time. So I just think just trying to anticipate a bit more and get the work started before the regulation lands.
And I'm going to move to Mike next, actually. From your perspective, obviously, previously with GSMA, you've seen technology and networks move on. In the UK, I shall avoid the B word, is in a slightly different relationship with Europe these days. We have a similar problem from a sort of a technology and innovation perspective. How can we try and ensure that what we're doing in the UK or Europe or anywhere else is reasonably reusable, and we can get those sort of minimum baselines out of the equipment we're bringing in, as Carl described, via whatever route we choose to do so?
So I think the start point is, I'm not sure, having been chief scientist in government, that the government understands the importance of the international dimension in quite the way you've described it. Certainly when I was chief scientist, I used to emphasize the importance of economies of scale and standards. So that's the bedrock. How do we build on those economies of scale and standards? But then if we start to diverge in terms of policies, there are some challenges. How do we avoid divergence of the policies around, for example, security or requirements for resilience? Some of these customers are international. They have private networks across boundaries, so therefore they need to be served, and I don't think government wants to get in the way of them being served. So things like knowledge exchange sessions such as this really help to think about how to deal with those international customers as well. But I would also say that the UK's got some leadership in some areas where we could help others. So if we think about the history of private networks, I was designing private networks on mobile back in the 1990s. And that roadmap is a very important roadmap to share. How far have we come? What lessons can we take from that? How do you make those private networks more secure so that those major customers feel comfortable? We can also see the history of network sharing and how that's evolved. How do we actually share across the network boundaries for consistency? So it's not just about government, it's also about learning as the industry changes its shape. I think the adoption of Wi-Fi as part of the cellular armoury cannot be ignored. You know, we clearly have smartphones that deal with both. We will see, and I'm doing some work on satellites now, how satellites will play a much bigger part as well. So I think that context needs to be well understood by government, but we need to avoid divergence and maybe uncertain standards that may arise through excessive divergence.
So, I guess, Justin, perhaps picking up on the standards or similar as an operator, from your perspective, any further thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think Carl touched on it. You know, similarly, we also operate across many diverse different countries. If we look across Africa, you know, we don't have a GDPR equivalent for Africa. The African Union tried to do it. I think it was 10 years ago, so now they put out the documents. Insufficient countries signed up to it, so each country is now issuing their own laws, and if they don't have laws, then it's up to the regulator, and you get erratic responses from the regulator. So it makes it quite difficult to have consistency in what you're doing across all the countries. Yes, you can set your policies and standards, but then you have to go and keep checking them with the regulator and keep using local legal practices to make sure that you're actually compliant. So instead of focusing on solving the problem, you're having to spend a lot of time and effort trying to do this. So, what could GSMA do to help there? Perhaps engaging with regulators across Africa in particular to sign up to the Africa Union privacy and security requirements so that we could have consistency would definitely be a step in the right direction.
Cool. And perhaps sort of expanding a topic out. So interestingly, over the last week or so, GSMA have been interviewing some security apprentices, which, investing in the next generation. And one of them asked me, he said, how do I measure whether or not we're getting it right? And I'm going to set this question for the panel very shortly. I view security as a three-point triangle with the financial controllers at one end. I'm ex-BT, so I'm very familiar with the need for cost control. So we've got the finance people at one end, we've got the users at another, and then we've got the product development people on the third point of the triangle. And the way I used to measure success, and I think I still do in GSMA, is if all of the points on the triangle are equally annoyed with me, then we're probably getting this about right. If any of them are happy, the other two are going to be really, really upset. So one of the challenges, which I now want to explore with the panel, linking back to the fraud point that Morgan started on, is security vulnerabilities and therefore the fraud that comes from them cost the industry, cost the users billions and billions of dollars. However, it is really, really difficult very often to persuade companies to invest, or the industry to invest, in the right security technologies. And that's because security is a cost. If we get it right, that's great, but people say to you, well, why did you spend all this money? Because nothing happened. If something happens, you've not spent it right. So, starting with Morgan, how do we better engage, certainly with the financial side of the businesses and the industry, and also Mike talked about to some degree from the sort of exchequer type side, persuading people that there is value in the security, especially through fraud reduction, and getting the sort of C-suite execs excited about security?
Again, I'll primarily speak for Vodafone here. These things, they're just not joined up. So the fraud teams report every month on their fraud losses. Some of them report on the customer side as well, which is another element I might circle back to. But we report that every month for our own agenda, essentially, and it never gets married, at least not in a satisfactory way, to the information coming out of our security teams. Yet, at this point in time, it's extremely clear how many of the threats are security and fraud sort of intersecting and harming customers and losing us a lot of money as businesses. So that is something that again, it has to start happening more in organisations, is putting those data sets, those KPIs, whatever you have, starting to give more thought to how they can be put together to make a compelling argument to senior management. Also, there are things that we in fraud really struggle to measure, to understand and measure at the moment. And if we were doing this more closely with security colleagues, we might be able to get a better grip of what we're actually losing. So then some of the numbers may grow and some of the arguments may solidify as well.
I like that. It's the measure what you're losing, as you say. Be careful what you wish for. The number gets bigger, they may be more scared.
Yes, double-edged sword.
I'll move to Mike. I mean, from your perspective, again, you've been in the industry quite a while. How can we get better at making that linkage between the value of security and the want to invest it, especially for that sort of driving down fraud side, which has historically proved a challenge?
So I start from the point of view of the customer rather than the operator. And I think making it clear to the customer how you're protecting them should be the real ethos. If it minimises their fraud and your fraud, that's a bonus. But I start with the security for the customer. I also think talking to sectors collectively with common language would really help to say how can telecoms make a difference to key sectors. It may be something GSMA should consider. How does the secure message reach into key sectors? I said earlier on I'm doing some work with space, and frankly, space and mobile convergence is happening rapidly as we speak. But actually their approach to security is totally different. It's much more vertically integrated as opposed to the enabler called open standards. But at the same time, bringing mobile and satellite together will be great, because the first GPS in a mobile phone was only in 1989. They haven't had to think about how to open up the world of applications and minimize the risk from a resilience point of view. They haven't had to deal with some of the issues around backhaul security in quite the same way as we might talk about it from a mobile industry point of view. And some of the converged solutions, whether it be through roaming or otherwise, need some knitting together of processes. If we take that logic of space into other sectors, how does the language of security fit other sectors? To me, it has to be led from that customer angle for those sectors we're talking about. And I can say all of them will want resilience, all of them will want lower costs, all of them will want better coverage, all of them will want solutions. But the language of security has to be in that message through to each of the sectors we deal with. And therefore, perhaps I'm playing more to the vertical industries that's part of this two-day seminar, but that's how I feel about the security. That doesn't say that the fraud work you're doing or minimizing fraud work is not important. Of course it's important, but from a customer point of view, we've got to be quite clear, what do they want?
Which is kind of where we'd sort of started with the whole user piece. So Justin, I mean, from your perspective, similar thoughts?
Yeah, again, though, working in markets with much lower ARPU, one has to look at cost-effective, fit-for-purpose security. We can't just put security in going, in theory, this looks great, the design is great, this will give us a perfect solution, that we then have to increase cost to customers. They then get less value for money, and they'll move to another operator who doesn't provide that level of security at that level of cost. So it's a constant balance around getting this right and making sure we give appropriate services and security for the customer based on where they are and their level of maturity.
And I've deliberately saved Carl till last on the basis that you kind of, from your opening piece, bridge some of the operator into vertical perspective. How do you see that in a sort of more joined up operator vertical? How do we get that better linkage and the language that Mike described?
Well, I'll start from the CEO perspective rather than the consumer perspective. The CEOs in our businesses, I think security is very much on their minds. The profile of security has been raised for many different reasons I'll come on to. And just like maybe 5 to 10 years ago, investors started to ask them, what are your plans for sustainability? What are your plans for my money investing in your business? What are your plans for carbon disclosure? Now they're asking, what are your plans for a post-quantum future? What are you doing about cryptography? What are you doing about supply chain diversification? What are you doing about this Cyber Resilience Act we've heard about? So it's on their minds, and they have to be able to speak that language. Part of what we need to do as a security industry is make their messaging appropriate when they're talking to investors, when they're talking to regulators on our behalf, because that side of the story has to be equally as convincing and strong as the discussions about consumers. And without nannying them, the C-suite needs pre-packaged solutions. We need to be very good at explaining why security investments are necessary, what impact they bring, when they're going to pay back, when you're going to get customer benefits, and ring the kind of commercial bells that we see. And that translates even through to the work that the GSMA Fraud and Security Group does. We're not very good at explaining the work that we do. There's many times I get the latest CR from Fraud and Security Group for approval at the Technology Group, and it says something like, this CR is an aggregation of further security controls on FS 33 to comply with 3GPP something, something, something. It doesn't say why this is relevant to a business. It doesn't say why a board member should be interested. You kind of need to explain the commercial value for every single one of these steps that we want something approved. My CEOs look at this and say, this is just even further regulation and further steps of standardization. All costs money to comply with. Where's the value in this? So there's a different way of explaining stuff to the C-suite that we need to be more familiar with. We need to speak their language.
Okay, mindful of the time, and I'm going to get a few more minutes out of this on the basis we started a couple late. There's a couple of final topics I want to briefly address. So later in the, I think it's later today after lunch, we're going to be looking at information sharing in slightly more detail. Now, I don't want to steal the thunder for that, but I do want to have a small warm-up on the basis that I've got an operator panel, whereas the panel later is slightly different. How can we, as my final point for the panel to discuss, get better collaboration and information sharing? I mean, Jeremy touched on this earlier on, and Carl also did in one of his responses, around the ability to share and regulators wanting to interfere with this. GSMA provides a platform through both the Fraud and Security Group. We have a new information or a Intel sharing group just been set up. So if you want to know more about that, ask Morgan afterwards. But how do we get more information sharing, either through TISAC, which is the GSMA's threat information sharing function, or through other mechanisms? How can we get more in so that the industry and the operators can get more out? And I'll perhaps again start with Morgan with your FASG hat on.
Okay, with FASG hat on, so we have just restarted the intelligence subgroup, and we're building a core team to drive that forwards. And again, that's a team balanced between security and fraud professionals. But it won't be easy, and I must apologise, I'm probably going to offer an observation here rather than a solution. There are still too many different places to share that information, too many organisations offering a way to share, and it's on the whole it's done with the very best intentions, but it's too fragmented as a result. So somehow we have to start reducing that number of different places to share and ways to share, and that should start to take us in the right direction. But I don't have a great answer on how we do that. So yeah.
So I'm going to go to Carl. Observations or solutions?
I like the idea that there are too many places to share, so let's start a new working group to talk about it. Yeah. Are we creating our own problems? Anyway.
We do it already. That's why.
Yeah.
It's just sort of formalising and growing what FASG does already.
Justin, go on. Solutions or problems? I'm going to work my way down here.
Combination of both. I think we do need these formal channels of doing it. There's too many of them. They don't work very well. So in the meantime, we also have all the informal channels. Those Telegram groups, Teams channels, etc. So that when something's happening, you can ping, let's call them colleagues rather than competitors, to say, hey, we're seeing this or you're seeing this, and see what's happening there. On the formal side, we've got the GSMA, we've got some of our vendors who we work closely with, like the likes of Huawei, and those work quite well, but are significantly slower in the turnaround time. So that's going to be more, hey, we saw this happening, maybe it's a couple of days, couple of weeks ago, as opposed to those informal channels which can get you an answer in minutes.
And finally to Mike, solutions or observations?
Well, I think threat intelligence sharing would be a natural goal internally within the membership, I would have thought, but making sure it works effectively, informally or informally. But I would say that for the sectors you want to serve, that probably needs a stronger dialogue. So if I was to pick three sectors that I think need a stronger dialogue with GSMA, I would say the transport area, whether it's automotive or rail, I think that needs a stronger lens of security and business development. I could say the health area, when I think of digital health and the uptake of digital health, I'm not sure GSMA has done enough with a security lens or a business development lens on that sector. And frankly, if we don't get that right, can you imagine, will digital health really happen or not? Probably not. And lastly, energy. I think there's a stronger case not to look at it from a climate change point of view, but from a business development, mobile with energy, how can that embrace security and make sure that digital adoption it takes a real part in that area. Cool. I think you've got a strong global voice, therefore why not try those three sectors?
Well, it's going to keep the GSMA busy, I think. Thanks, Mike. So what I'd like to do is ask my panellists for their final sort of 30-second takeaway. I'm aware we're between you and I think some coffees. So, Mike, I'm going to start with you and work down.
Keep the dialogue going, but think outside the box beyond pure mobile only.
Morgan.
Think more about our customers, particularly those that are more vulnerable, because they're more likely to fall victim to fraud and security attacks. I'm talking both consumer and small, medium businesses that, as mentioned earlier, have less resource and specialised resource to protect themselves. So let's look at it that way.
Justin.
Yeah, look, working together we can do more than working alone, and we have a common customer base. Whether somebody's a customer of mine today and yours tomorrow and back with me the next day, if we can educate customers together, I think we can do a lot more than doing it alone.
And Carl.
I think our biggest challenge is managing the complexity of the landscape and understanding the capabilities of cybercrime.
So with that, I'd like to thank the panel for answering all my questions.